you. Okay. Actually, before our next contribution from the audience, I would like to ask a couple of questions myself to Christopher Snowdon. I would like to start with one question regarding really the history of anti-smoking, main topic of your book. We were talking a couple of times about health fascism, health Nazism, etc. The tobacco control campaign in the Third Reich was very much a forerunner of what we have now. I mean, the term passive smoking was invented 70 years ago, although not by a Nazi, but by a social democrat who was allowed to do his tobacco control work at that time. Can you tell us more about early tobacco control ideology in the Third Reich?
It's a big question. What can I say about it? I mean, it is historically absolutely accurate. I'm sure most people in this room have probably read something about it, probably involving Robert Proctor. John wrote an article about it towards the end of last year. I mean, it's a difficult area, but the simple truth of the matter is that yes, the term passive smoking came directly from the Nazis. It didn't exist before then, and they had, you know, the biggest anti-smoking campaign of the 20th century up until very, very late in the 20th century, really. It is an extraordinary story, and it seems largely based on the obsession of Hitler himself. There was something of a history of kind of anti-smoking sentiment in Germany, which was stronger than in the rest of Europe. Smoking was still banned and punishable by death relatively late on in the 17th century, and indeed into the next century. But that doesn't mean it was inevitable. It's a bit like the anti-Semitism issue, to be honest. There was anti-Semitism in Germany prior to Hitler coming to power, but it seems to be mainly Hitler's own personal obsession that really made it part of Nazi policy. And you can certainly argue that if a Nazi party had arisen without Hitler, then it probably wouldn't have had anti-Semitism as its key issue. Similarly with the smoking issue, it was mainly Hitler's own mad obsession with it after he threw his cigarettes into the Danube. The Danube, when he was an impoverished, failed painter, and he kept pushing it. It's amazing. In 1944, with a war on several fronts and Third Reich collapsing, he's passing laws to prevent female bus conductors being exposed to passive smoke. It's beyond belief, really. And the whole issue is very complex because I don't think it's not as simple as saying, well, they were Nazis and they were anti-smokers, therefore all anti-smokers are Nazis. It's not as simple as making that case. And I read a book not so long ago called The Secret War of Cancer, which is very much the everything gives you cancer side of the story. And Deborah Davis, an American epidemiologist who wrote it, she was more or less defending pretty much every aspect of the Nazi war against smokers, because they would argue that, well, the Nazis were the first people who provided any decent evidence that smoking caused lung cancer, therefore it was natural that they had an anti-smoking campaign. But what I would say would be, actually the evidence that the Nazis amassed wasn't as huge as has been made out since, and it was quite right, really, that the Allies after the war said, well, this is Nazi science, and therefore we don't believe it, because it wasn't backed up by anything else anybody else had been doing. And all right, a lot of it might have turned out to be, to a greater or lesser extent, true, but the Nazis believed in all sorts of mad scientific things, phrenology and things like this. You can quite understand that the Allies, since they had no other reason to suspect cigarettes, would just dismiss it. Now that has been rewritten now as being, well, the Allies let themselves down. And in this book I'm talking about, the author actually says the Nazis, within years of finding out that cigarettes cause lung cancer, were doing something about it. It took the rest of the world 40 or 50 years. Well, I don't really buy it. By the 60s, America and Britain had far greater volume of a greater body of evidence against smoking than the Nazis had in the 30s. But they didn't launch a Nazi-style campaign against smoking. Not because they had less evidence, they had far more evidence, but just because they weren't Nazis. It's not the amount of evidence they had, it's what you do with it that shows your character. And Robert Proctor, in his recent sort of defence of Nazi anti-smoking campaign, uses the example of the rocket and says, well, they have rocket science, but does that mean anybody who develops a rocket is a Nazi? Well, no, it doesn't. It's what you do with a rocket. It's what the Nazis did with the rockets that was the problem. It's what they do with the rocket. It's one thing to develop it, it's what you actually do. And with the Nazi anti-smoking campaign, what made it Nazi-ish was not the information it was based on, it was how they dealt with the problem. I can't put it much better than that.
And the interesting aspect is, of course, to what extent does the campaign today differ from